G'day YouTubers, at long last we've reached the final episode in the series on Central Moreton Bay. I'm sorry this last video's taken so long to get out. I had intended to do a screen recording of my tablet and looking for spots in the bay on that, but I had some technical difficulties. My tablet wasn't working. I had to pull it apart and rewire bits of it to get it to charge the battery. And once I'd done that, I found the touch screen wasn't working, so I had to go back to square one and rethink what I was going to do in this video. I'm sorry it's not quite what I intended, but it's the best I can do given the equipment I've had to work with. I do want to carry on with some general fishing videos. I want to do some more of them. Quite keen to do some more of them actually, but I also want to do a series on the Northern Moreton Bay. I will start that in a little while. I might just have a short spell from that, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and then get that series started. In the meantime, I'll be doing the normal fishing videos and trying to give you some spots and rigs to use, baits to use, all that sort of thing to get you onto the fish. But that's all in the future. What we want to do now is roll a clip on this video. In this episode I'm going to take a look at one of the tools that I use to get an idea where it might be worth looking for fish. My favourite tool for this is the Navionics charts. They've always had bottom contour lines, but now with the contour shading that they have, it makes it a lot easier to see spots that might be worth having a look at. On this screen I have an overlay from the Navionics charts. I've shaded the bottom for the various depths to make it easier to see what's happening. But first of all, I just want to draw your attention to that green zone at the top of the screen that's flashing on and off. Some of the most interesting bottom is in that area. It's now off limits to us, so just be aware, don't go searching in there for any fish. The blue area on the overlay that you see is the Navionics standard sonar bottom shading. It's meant to give you an idea of the bottom in 3D. Of course it's not full 3D, but the shading on it's meant to show shadows where there's hills. The computer technique's called hill shading, and it does make the irregularities in the bottom stand out more. Of course all this is taken from sonar data that we upload back to Navionics from our trips, and they process it and give it back to us as good maps to use for fishing. I'll just add some captions to this to show the colours that I've used to shade the various depths. There's only 5 different colours in the Navionics apps that you can use for shading, and I wanted to make it a little bit more fine grained, so I've shaded depths from 12 down to over 24 metres in steps of 3 metres. So that's nearly 10 foot a step. It's a fair change in depth, but given that we only have 5 colours, that's what I had to do. As you can see, a lot of the bay is fairly shallow, but there are some interesting areas that are deep enough to register on this. Navionics have another system as well for showing the bottom up, and that's called relief shading. It's very similar to the sonar shading, but this time they've added colour to it as well as textures, not only to indicate the bottom but also the colours help define the depth. I don't know that it's as good as the sonar shading for Australia yet. I've seen some of the shots from the American maps and they are really good, but I don't know that there's enough detail from their scans of Australia to make it as good in Australia. I'm certainly not feeling that the area that I look at in Moreton Bay is as good as their sonar shading anyway. I like that better. Might be just the way that my eyes work. If you decide to have a look at the app, give them both a go and see which one works best for you. We'll start by looking at an area that's marked on all the maps of Moreton Bay, and that is the deep trench to the east of Green Island. You can see there's an arrow there flashing along the length of the trench, just in case you're not familiar with it. It's pretty obvious where it is. You can see the colour change as it gets deeper. I'll just talk about some of the aspects of that on the chart. First of all, I'll just draw your attention to that very small deep spot that drops down to about 21 metres. That's very close to some marks that I've fished on the northern end of that deep trench. And if you'll notice that the drop off on the northwestern side of that deep spot is very steep, whereas on the southeastern side it's a fairly shallow drop off, which probably explains why where I fished was closer to that northeast end. If you have a look back through some of the marks that I've put up in the previous videos, you should find 1 or 2 very close to the coordinates that I've got there for that deep spot. So I think having a bit of a sound around that area would be worthwhile. Once you find the hole, just sound around it and see if you can see any sign of fish. Here's the spot in the trench that I didn't know about until just now actually. I had sort of seen in the past that there was more of a drop-off down towards the southern end, just on the contour lines, but I didn't realise just how big it was until I shaded it and looked here. This time the southeastern side of that trench looks to be the deeper drop-off, the steeper drop-off I should say, and having a sound along that might produce dividends as well. In fact, looking along the deep trench, the southeastern side of the trench seems to be a fairly steep drop-off through most of its length. Just off to the east of the trench a little bit, there's another couple of holes. They go down to 21 metres and could be worth a sound around as well. Again, a couple of holes that I didn't know existed until I was doing this video and setting up the colours. And once again, the eastern side of this hole offers the steeper drop-off into it. Yeah, I'm not sure how long this feature's been in the Navionics maps, but I only discovered it probably less than a year ago. I use the colours a lot for finding spots offshore, but I haven't used them so much inshore. Here I've marked 3 more depressions in the ocean floor, but the sides of them aren't very steep. As you can see, they're sort of in the middle of the colour band above them, which means they are gradual lowering down to that depth. I'll just mention at this point that you can't always rely on these Navionics maps to be 100% accurate. At least that's been my experience when I've been looking for these features outside. There's been some quite large features on the ocean floor that I thought, oh, that'll be a great spot to fish. I've gone out and gone around in circles and not found a single thing on the sounder. So the maps of the ocean floor are not 100% accurate. They're made up of hydrographic surveys and they're enhanced by data that we send back to Navionics from our sounders. They take that data, process it, enhance the maps, and of course when we update the maps we get that data. But as I said, it's not always 100% accurate, so if you go around and round and you're not finding the spot that you think should be on the map, then put that down to the fact that the map's not 100% accurate and go and look for another one. Now this is another area that's situated between the deep trench and Harry Atkinson's reef. It drops down to between 21 and 24 metres, and what makes it interesting is it has fairly steep sides. Now, they're not vertical drops or anything, but you can see by the contour lines where they get closer together that it's fairly steep, and also tells you that it's fairly steep is that the colour bands either side of it are closer together. The greenish colour that's beside the central trench isn't very wide in places. In particular, the drop-off to the east of it comes from fairly shallow, the 12 to 15 metre range, and then goes all the way to the 21 to 24 metre range. So that's a reasonable drop-off there. The drop-offs to the east a little bit less steep, but I think that would be a good area to have a sound around as well. Again, bearing in mind that you might not even find it. This is an area I haven't looked at, haven't noticed it on the sounder before, but just going through the maps here to see what I can find. But there's one that looks as though it'd be worth spending a little bit of time having a sound around, particularly if you're heading out to Harry's and you find that it's crowded. Just have a bit of a sound around that area. You might find that it's a better fishing spot on the day than going into a crowded Harry's where all the boat noise is frightening the fish away. Just to the west of that trench there's a hill that the arrows are pointing to now. We'll just zoom in and have a quick look at that. The blue spot in the centre of the screen is the actual top of the hill. It's 13.5 metres underwater, and you can see the trench that we've been talking about just a little bit over to the west of it. Getting a depth reading off the trench, the bottom of the trench is 21.5 metres down, so that's a difference of 8 metres or about 25-26 feet between the top of the hill and the bottom of the trench. And just taking the distance between the top of the hill and the bottom of the trench, it's 0.1 kilometres, so that's 100 metres. Because we're limited to reading 0.1 of a kilometre, it could be anywhere from 0.1 to 0.2 of a kilometre. However, I was very careful in the measurement and it just ticked over to 0.1 of a kilometre just over the edge of the trench. So it is about 100 metres from the top of the hill to the bottom of the trench. What does that mean for fishing, you ask? Well, it may not mean anything, but Let's have a look at somewhere that we know fish go to and that a lot of good fish are caught, and just compare it to what we're looking at here. This screen may look very similar, but this is actually the foul ground on the other side of Harry's Reef, and that spot that we're looking at, that little blue hill that we're looking at near the centre of the screen, is the principal fishing spot in the foul ground. Just turning on the fish symbols, the public ones that are marked in the Navionics map, you'll see there's a lot of symbols around that hill, and I can attest that some really good fish get into that area. I went across it one day when I didn't really have time to fish. I couldn't believe how the sounder lit up just over that hill with all the fish that were there. On the weekend when there's a lot of boating activity, there's not as many fish there, but if you can get out there midweek when there's no one else around, it can be a gold mine at the right time, the right tide and the right time of year. So, why are we looking at this hill in the foul ground? Answer simple. The top of the hill's 11.5 metres underwater, which is just a little bit less than the one we looked at on the other side of Harry's. Looking at the base of the hill, it drops down to 15 metres of water. So that's only a drop of 4.5 metres. And yet this hill attracts a lot of fish. Anyone that's been out here and fished this will tell you it attracts a lot of fish. And looking at the distance from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, on the side with the sharpest drop-off, we find that that is also 0.1 kilometres or 100 metres. Now, does that mean that the other one on the other side of Harry's is going to produce a lot of fish? Well, maybe not. It depends what's down there on the bottom. This is the foul ground, so I have no idea what that hill is made up of. It may be just a whole pile of rocks and rubble that's been dumped there, or goodness knows what was allowed to be dumped in the bay back then. Maybe the one on the other side is just plain sandy bottom. But I'll tell you one thing for sure, they're similar enough that I reckon the one on the other side is worth spending a little bit of time going round in circles and sounding around just to see what is there. So are there any more spots like the foul ground around? If we have a look just north of Harry's, where I was talking about in the last episode, we can find there's at least 3 spots that look a bit like the hill at the foul ground. They're not proper hills, but they do have the same sort of drop-off on at least one side. You can see the arrows there and the little double-ended arrows pointing to the drop-off area. Again, I haven't looked at these, so I don't know personally what they're like. Also, up in that area, there's some sort of trenches, valleys, whatever you'd like to call them. And the contour lines are fairly close together on some of them, so that indicates a fairly steep drop down into it. Again, somewhere to have a look at if Harry's is crowded. You might just want to go up there and have a bit of a sound around. Just jumping back over to the foul ground, up on the northern side of the foul ground, there's another smaller hill. It's got some steeper drop-offs around it. They're not very deep, but you don't need a very deep drop-off. There's a couple of areas along the 29 fathom line when I go fishing offshore. There's a drop-off that's less than 2 metres, and on the right tide that's always good for some fish. So this one may be worth a look at. Again, as I say, sometimes you go looking for these features and they're just not there at all. But it's another one that you may be worth a look if you're going past, you're not too far away, it doesn't take very long to check it out. Just have a quick look around the rest of the Central Bay and see what else we can see with the settings that I've already got into the Navionics application. Of course, there's the shipping channel. There's big steep drop-offs beside that. I'll talk a little bit more about them when I get into the northern part of the bay, but do be careful if you decide to fish them. Big ships can't stop or change direction very easily, so it's up to you to stay out of their way. Keep an eye out for them, make sure you stay out of their way, and also be aware that some of them put up quite a wash. In the Rous channel, I've got an arrow there pointing roughly to the Rous knob just to give you some orientation. So there's a couple of deeper patches near the Rous knob. Further to the southwest there's a couple more areas that are showing up as deeper, but the main thing about the Rous channel is the drop-offs at the sides, in my opinion. The West Peel Artificial Reef is situated on a deeper area, obviously just to the west of Peel, but there is a little valley that runs due north from there for quite some distance. I have had a bit of a look around that, and while I have caught a few mackerel up towards the north end of it, I haven't found it to be very consistent, and certainly not a place that I'd be going back to target. Have a look around it by all means, but that's my experience of it. Looking at the areas around Goat and Bird Island, we've already talked about them very early in this series for fishing spots, but looking at the bottom contours there, it looks like the fishing spots could be more extensive than I ever knew. The ones I fished were productive, but those bottom contours look like a bit more searching around could reveal some other spots there. And finally, there's one more area down near Coochie, just to the southwest end of the Coochie Artificial Reef. And most of these areas don't mean anything. They're only a small drop of around 3 metres or so. The thing you need to do is look at the depth of the blue area beside them and then the depth of the area that's shaded and see just how much drop there is and how steep the drop is. You can tell that by how close together the contour lines are. If the drop from one level to another is very steep, then it's certainly worth my while to go and have a look at it. But if the drop from one level to another has a very gradual slope, then unless there's something specifically on the bottom to attract the fish, there's not much point in me going to have a look at it. Everywhere I go on the bay, I've got the sounder on, I've got my eye on it, just in case. You never know what you're going to run over. And it's always a good idea to keep one eye on the sounder and throw a mark in whenever you see something interesting. If it looks very interesting, circle back and have a look at it at a slower speed. But otherwise, just leave your mark there. Next time you're going past, have another look at it, see if it's still there, see if it's of any real interest. It does tend to clutter up the GPS a bit, but I've got a program where I bring my marks out and sort them and categorise them, which makes it a little bit easier to manage. This video is getting quite long now, so I just want to quickly go through some of the areas that we've already looked at using the Navionics relief shading, just so you can see the difference. And we'll start at the Rous channel and the Rous knob. The relief shading makes it quite easy to see the contours on the bottom there. It doesn't tell you that there's going to be fish there, but it tells you that it's worth a look. Looking at Mud Island, you can see all the main areas that should be of interest to you. I'll leave it as an exercise to the viewer to go back through my other video where I do go around Mud Island mentioning fishing spots and compare it to what you're seeing on the bottom. That should help give you a good idea of what you look for on the bottom when you're looking for a new area. Still at Mud Island, this time focusing on the northern tip around Jay's Reef. You can see there's a lot of areas around here where the contour lines are very close together, indicating a steep change in depth. They're always good areas to look around for fish. And going down to St Helena, there's an area that again I spoke about in a previous video. You can see the bottom contours here. It's just outside the green zone, so if you do check it out, be very careful to stay outside that green zone. A quick look on the northeastern side of green shows that there's a few areas there that would warrant a little bit of sounding around just to see if they're of any further interest. The contours on the bottom look as though they might be, but it would depend a lot on how much the depth changes. I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer to go and have a look at that on their Navionics app. Moving over to the seafloor around Bird and Goat Island, you can clearly see the drop-offs I mentioned in an earlier video. I'd have to say that having these seafloor maps available on Navionics makes finding spots a hell of a lot easier than going out and trying to do a search pattern with your sounder. Many years ago that was the only way to do it, but these days it is just so much simpler, saves a lot of time. I'm not saying that you're going to find all the possible fishing areas just by sitting in your living room looking at a map, but what it is going to do for you is save you a lot of time and a lot of petrol by letting you target the spots that are most likely. And looking at the Moreton Reef, you can see how rich the bottom is in structure there. Lots and lots of structure to fish. And just looking at the map, you've got to say that is well worth going to, and we know it is well worth going to because a lot of fish have been caught there. And that's another key point in looking at the map to see what might be worth fishing, and that is to have a look at the structure around known good fishing spots and then go and look around the map and see if you can find anything similar. That's what we did up around Harry's. We looked at the foul ground and said, yeah, that's a good fishing spot, and then we went and looked around that general area to see if there was any other structure that looked much the same. It all depends what's on the bottom, what sort of bottom it is, whether it's rock or sand or what have you, but looking for similar areas of structure gives you a starting point. You still got to go and do the hard yards with sounding, burn some petrol, burn some time, but if you're like me and you just like being out in the water, that's no big deal. If you're only wanting to go out there and catch a few fish and go home, then this probably isn't for you. Now, just a few words on hunting up your own spots. It's very time consuming, it uses a fair bit of petrol, and often there is no end result by way of fish taken home. You can go and check out a lot of spots that you think may produce fish and find none of them do. You can go and check out a spot you think may produce fish and find out that that spot doesn't even exist. I've found several of those spots when I've been outside fishing offshore. I see some structure on the map and think I'll check that out, go looking for it, and the seafloor's just dead flat. There is nothing there. Now, it takes patience, and I guess it's got to be something you enjoy doing and you just enjoy being out in the water, fossicking around, seeing what you can turn up. If that's your personality, then go for it. You'll have a ball. I do. But if you just want to get out there and fish, then I'm sorry, this video probably hasn't done anything much to help you. The other thing worth mentioning is once you find the spot and you establish that it's going to be a good spot for fishing, or at least you think it is, then you've got to learn all the nuances of that spot. What time to fish it, what tide, all the things you have to know about any spot to fish it effectively. But that's part of the fun, learning all that. Be that as it may, this is the final episode in the Central Moreton Bay series. I thank you very much for watching it, particularly if you've watched it all the way through from the beginning. I did a few on Southern Moreton Bay before I started this series. There wasn't that many there because I haven't spent as much time in the Southern Moreton Bay as I have up in the Central. I will be going on to do a series on the Northern Moreton Bay, and again after that one offshore. But to be honest, I'll probably take a few weeks break and just do some general fishing videos or crabbing or something like that before I start on the Northern Moreton Bay. I just feel a little bit burnt out after this. I hadn't intended to do the series as quickly as I had. I sort of thought I'd do one episode of it a month, and I think I've turned out one every couple of weeks. It was mainly that you guys seem to appreciate them so much, and I got so many likes and comments and subscribers and everything out of it that it sort of encouraged me to do it a lot quicker than I'd originally intended. So I just need a little break to do some general fishing, boating, what have you, and then I'll get back into it. If you don't want to miss the Northern Moreton Bay series, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. You can check what videos I upload, and they'll start to come through in a month, 6 weeks, something like that. I hope you got something out of the series as a whole. I hope it's helped you with your fishing around Central Moreton Bay. Until next time, good fishing.